The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 53 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Do you believe in the supernatural? In ghosts, zombies, or perhaps witches? Today we celebrate All Hallows Eve with an exploration of the specters and witches that haunted 17th century Massachusetts. That's right, our topic for the day is the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692. Our guide for this exploration is Emerson W. Baker, author of A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience. During our conversation, Tad sets the scene for the Salem witchcraft trials by telling us about what Massachusetts and Salem were like in 1692. He reveals information about the people involved in the Salem witch trials, and he discusses the aftermath of the trials and how the people of Salem worked to put the trials behind them. But before I scare you with our exploration of historic ghosts and witches, I have something I'd like to share with you. Over the past year, you have reached out via email and social media to find out how you could help support Ben Franklin's World. Today, I am pleased to announce that I have finally created a crowdfunding campaign, a campaign that I like to call the Ben Franklin's World Movement. If you are interested in supporting the show, either financially or in other non-financial ways, please visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement. On the Ben Franklin's World Movement webpage, you'll find a short, neat little video that provides a behind-the-scenes look at the show. You'll discover my plans for how I'd like to expand the show and details for how you can help support Ben Franklin's World. Okay, are you ready to travel back to 17th century Massachusetts and discover more about the Salem witchcraft trials? Let's go meet our guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us today, we have an archaeologist and professor of history from Salem State University. His research interests center on how colonists adapted and transmitted regional English cultures from England to the New World. He is the author and co-author of 5 books, including The Devil of Great Island, Witchcraft and Conflict in Early New England, and, most recently, A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Emerson Baker.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be here.
You have a fascination with the witchcraft trials because you've written at least 2 books on witchcraft in New England, and you have an app for our smartphones about the Salem witch trials. What drew you to study witchcraft in New England?
You know, I think historians are drawn to witchcraft, and it isn't just me, because, as I'm sure you know, Liz, there are literally a couple of dozen actually really good books on the Salem witch trials. I think historians are always interested and fascinated with times of crisis and change, and witchcraft is really sort of a symptom of that change. I think studying witchcraft gives us lots of really fascinating insights into a wide range of aspects of life in 17th century New England, which was a time of the early modern period, a time of pretty intense change for the first generations of settlers to New England.
And this period of change caused quite the crisis. So, Tad, the Salem witch trials took place in 1692. Set the scene for us. What was going on in colonial New England in 1692?
The English settlements in New England were really under a serious threat on many fronts in 1692. They were amid a war with the French and their Native American allies in northern New England, and it was a war that was going terribly badly for Massachusetts. The colony was also politically unstable. It had an interim government that had been in place since 1689 when Governor Andros and his Dominion of New England had been overthrown. And actually, when the witch trials, the first accusations break out, the Massachusetts colony is expecting the arrival of a new governor, Sir William Phipps, with a new charter. So essentially, lots of change in the air. And there's other things going on too. The war has worsened an economic depression, and perhaps maybe the biggest concern is that people are afraid that in Massachusetts, the city upon the hill, the Puritan colony, that Puritanism is in decline. Church membership is dropping. People are swaying from their original religious mission to New England, and all of these problems in the colony seem to be a sign that God was indeed displeased with the Puritan experiment. And, Liz, in the 17th century, anything could be taken as a sign of God's pleasure and displeasure, and it certainly looked like he was very upset with his chosen people in New England.
New England and Massachusetts in particular, they all have charters, and Massachusetts is getting a new one, and you mentioned that. Would you remind us what a charter is and why a new charter in Massachusetts is such a big deal?
The charter is the official governance of the colony. It's granted to a colony by the king, and it really sets up the government who's going to rule, what the rights are of the citizens. And Massachusetts' original charter of 1629 had been granted in a very, shall we say, loose and cavalier way, where Massachusetts Bay was essentially allowed to rule itself, to govern without any interference from the king, and to establish Puritanism as the official state religion, and it really was a Puritan colony. This charter had been lost in the early 1680s and had really led to essentially a military dictatorship in Massachusetts for several years, and the end of Puritan exclusivity, where other faiths were allowed to worship freely. And finally, in 1692, Governor Phipps, a boy from Maine, a Boston merchant, was coming back with the leading minister of the colony, Increase Mather, from England, with a new charter that would restore many of those liberties. And it wasn't as good as the original 1629 charter, but it was a pretty good deal that largely restored Massachusetts as a Puritan colony. So people were excited about that, but they were also very concerned about what their rights and liberties would be and how things would change from the past.
And in the face of the war they're experiencing, I'm sure they are also hoping for a bit more law and order, a little more order to their lives.
Right, absolutely. There had been, in many ways, it's sort of been a time of really uncertainty as to who was running the colony and what was going on. And unfortunately, that doesn't get any better when Governor Phipps arrives, because the charter essentially says, guess what? All those old laws you passed under your old charter without supervision from England, well, they're null and void. And what Massachusetts has to do is pass a whole new set of laws, and these have to be in complete agreement with the English law and English Constitution. So essentially, once the governor arrives, the first job of the government is going to have to be to write the whole new set of laws for the colony that they've worked on really for the past 60, 70 years. So even when the governor arrives, it doesn't do much to bring that certainty and to bring that lawful nature. And in fact, it takes several months to even formally reestablish the county court system.
Now that we've set the scene for the colony, let's look at Salem. Would you tell us about the early history of Salem and when and why it was established?
Very few people realize this, but Salem was first settled by English settlers in 1626. I should point out it's on a site that was occupied by Native Americans for thousands of years because it is a spectacular harbor and a great place to fish. And in fact, that's what first drew Native Americans and English there. It was actually called, in Native language, it was called Namkig, which means the fishing place. So Salem is actually the second oldest town in Massachusetts, second only to Plymouth, and the first settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Company. I think people always assume that's Boston, but it's not. So in a way, then, when John Winthrop arrives in 1630 in the colony with a great fleet and gives the famous model of Christian charity sermon where he talks about this idea of a city upon a hill, a shining example of Puritanism, he's really in some ways not just metaphorically but physically talking about Salem, because it's only after they realize that maybe they don't like Salem so much that Winthrop and most of the gang moved downriver. But be that as it may, Salem will remain the second most important settlement in Massachusetts throughout the colonial era, a very important place. And initially it occupies much of the North Shore. If you look at the North Shore of Massachusetts today, that original grant of Salem now comprises all or part of 9 cities and towns. So it was just this huge territory. And by 1692, a few of those territories had split off into separate towns. And we're really kind of left with two very distinctive, there really were two Salems in 1692, Liz, and they're very different places. I'll refer to them as Salem Village and Salem Town to differentiate them, but at the time it was a little more amorphous than that. Salem Town is your large commercial center, your bustling seaport with merchants and sailors and a fishing fleet and craftsmen and artisans. And contrast that with the countryside. Salem Village, or Salem Farms, which is the area today in the interior, say, west of Route 128, as we locals would say in Massachusetts, but, around present-day Danvers and Peabody. And that's really a farming community, and it's a very different place, a much smaller place. Salem Town may have about 2,000 residents. Salem Village, probably around 500-600 people in 1692. So it really was kind of like the rural, agrarian farmland that helped support that growing international trading city on the coast. And it's also, too, clearly a hotbed of Puritanism. It's founded on that, but it's also a city of contrast in some ways, because we know that probably about 10% of the adult population are Quakers, which at the time were really kind of a persecuted minority in Massachusetts. So it's a complex place, and the kind of place where you're going to have tensions that could erupt into witchcraft accusations. That's a long answer.
When we're talking about the Salem witch trials, are we referring to Salem Town or Salem Village or both?
It's a complicated answer. Most of the action, the accusations and the accusers and most of the accused initially come from Salem Village. But Salem Town is the county seat. It's the home of many of the judges, and it is where the trials take place. So it's sort of confusing, because today when people come to Salem, I tell them that if they really want to see the kind of the action in the witch trials and the sites, they really need to go to present-day Danvers, Massachusetts, which was Salem Village in 1692. But on the other hand, Salem Town has, the surviving house that was owned by one of the judges, the site of the courthouse, and the jail, sort of the administrative center. So it really is sort of all throughout Salem, and frankly, the accusations will extend throughout over a dozen towns, stretching throughout Essex County and even to the south. There's an afflicted girl even in Boston in 1692. So it starts in Salem and then spreads outward.
This seems like a good transition to look at the trials. Tad, would you provide us with a brief overview of the Salem witch trials as a whole? When and how did the controversy begin?
It's hard to be brief on this one, Liz, because it's complicated, but we'll give you the quick elevator version of it, I guess, right? It all really started in Salem Village, which was a troubled community. And the village was deeply divided by several decades of factionalism that focused around the minister and the meeting house. The essential problem here is that Salem Village had tried to separate from Salem Town and become their own community, but had not been allowed to do so. But had finally been allowed, they said, okay, how about this? We'll let you hire a minister and build a meeting house to hold your religious services, but you still have to come here and serve in the militia and do, your civic obligations in Salem Town. So it's kind of a half-formed community, and there's no, again, back to that lawlessness theme, there's no one really in charge in Salem Village. There's no real government. And in the course of 20 years, they actually go through 4 ministers. Samuel Parris, who's the minister in 1692, is the 4th minister in a fairly short time span, as you have sort of factions rise and fall, and people get unhappy with the minister and don't want to pay taxes. So it's just a lot of factional strife in the village. And in fact, in the fall of 1691, Samuel Parris's opposition gains control of the committee that pays his salary, and they refuse to pay his salary and to provide firewood for the parsonage in the home where he lives, in hopes that he'll just leave the town. Parris refuses to do this and really kind of digs in his heels, starts to preach sermons where he's talking about there's signs that Satan is present and that Satan is attacking Salem Village. And before long, Parris's niece and daughter, the niece who lives with him, show the first signs of bewitchment. And this is in January of 1692, and by March, a doctor provides a formal diagnosis of witchcraft, and things very quickly escalate. The numbers of afflicted increase, accusations grow in Salem Village, they'll spread outwards. The formal trials will begin in June, with further sessions in July, in August, and September. Throughout the summer and fall, the accusations will spread, and before the trials had ended, there were actually even more people accused in neighboring Andover than in Salem. So I don't know why we don't call it the Andover trials. So the whole trials themselves took place over about a year, starting formally from in June of 1692 and lasting until 1693. So this is a long, drawn-out process that involves hundreds of people throughout much of the colony.
Gives a whole new meaning to trial of the century. I mean, these are the trials of the 17th century.
Absolutely. We have 156 people who had some sort of formal legal proceeding started against them that we know of. There are almost 1,000 documents that survive from the trials of 1692, so we know a lot about them. But frankly, we know that there are a lot more that don't exist, and we're pretty sure that some of them early on were probably deliberately destroyed because of some of the incriminating things that were in them.
When I read A Storm of Witchcraft, it became obvious to me that there were 4 parties involved with these witch trials. You have the accusers are afflicted, the accused, the judges, and the public. Tad, would you tell us about who the accusers were and why they claimed to be victims of witchcraft?
One of the reasons I wrote this book is because there's so many mistaken assumptions and facts that are just wrong about the Salem witch trials. And this is something, having taught at Salem State for over 20 years, you begin to realize. And one of those mistaken assumptions is who the afflicted were. There's traditionally this group called the afflicted girls who are seen to be sort of at the heart of the controversy. But it's not that simple. Yes, the first afflicted, Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail Williams, are young girls, ages like 9 to 11. In the core group of accusers of 8 or 10 people, it's really a group of young women, mostly between the ages of about 18 and 20. There are also several older women, 30s and 40s, and even one described as an ancient woman. There's a young boy who actually, Liz, believe it or not, is the son of one of the judges, Judge Corwin. So how's that for conflict of interest? And even Reverend Paris's Native American slave, John Indian. So that's a pretty diverse group. But of this group, all of them had one thing in common. They acted as if they were bewitched, and in particular, they claimed that specters, and by specters we mean spirits or ghosts of people, they claimed that the specters of people were afflicting them, which means that this ghost is causing you great pain and suffering, choking you, strangling you, hitting you, prodding you with a knife, and such things to cause you tremendous suffering. But of course, this is completely invisible to anybody except the afflicted. So this is a pretty rare thing, and it's kind of, even in early modern witchcraft, and is sort of the hallmark of Salem. So that's one group, but that's just part of the puzzle, because in addition to this core group of, 10 to 15 people, there are about 200 other folk who testified about what we'd consider more traditional acts of magic, things that you see outside of Salem. Death or illness of animals. My cow dried up and stopped producing milk, and that was after you cursed me. Preternatural knowledge. You know about events far away or things that there's no way you could have knowledge of. People who were supposedly transformed into animals or had animal familiars. So you can see it's a pretty large and diverse group, and as I like to point out throughout the book, you really can't isolate a single cause for the afflictions or the accusations. Now, having said that, if you look at the key accusers, at least, those afflicted girls and young women, they do have some things in common. Most of them, almost all of them initially at least, are from Salem Village and reflect those tensions we talk about in the community. And most of them live in households that are very much involved in this conflict over Reverend Paris's ministry. As to what's really wrong with them today, that's a book in its own right, but I think, again, it's a number of different things. Some of these people, particularly those young girls at first, are suffering from what we call today mass conversion disorder or mass psychogenic illness, which used to be called mass hysteria. Others were refugees from the Frontier War who were suffering quite clearly from what we now consider to be post-traumatic stress disorder. And yes, there were clearly some faking, fraudulent behavior by some of these people to accuse people. And honestly, probably more than our modern-day society cares to admit, because we like to think the best about people, particularly about young people. So it's a pretty mixed bag, isn't it?
It is. Were the accused also a mixed bag? I mean, who were the afflicted accusing of witchcraft?
Oh, they are too. As you can imagine, if you have 156 formally accused, at least 16 more informally cried out upon, but with no charges. You can imagine it's going to be a wide-ranging group. But I should start off by saying that witchcraft really throughout time, and it really is kind of a timeless crime that pretty much every society and every culture has some version of. It's predominantly a female crime. Universally, about 75% of the people accused are women. And usually many of the men accused are those who were relatives of those women or their defenders. And in fact, witchcraft is believed to be passed on through a family. And that pattern pretty much holds for Salem. So, again, most of the accused are women. witchcraft normally, aside from Salem, is considered what we might call a working class crime, right? Round up the usual suspects. The poor, the scandalized, the outcasts are accused. And essentially, it's part of a process, again, that it's still an issue today, of scapegoating, of isolating people, seeing them as the cause of your problems because they're different from you in some way. And that's how it started in Salem Village. That really is. You really start off with the usual suspects. But where Salem differs and why Salem becomes so big is because quite quickly, the people accused, the profile will change. It'll go, not only will it sort of grow outward from Salem, but it'll also go up the social ladder so that very respectable people are accused, like Rebecca Nurse, who's a devout Puritan woman, a grandmother, beloved by everybody, yet she's accused of witchcraft. And eventually all the way to the top of that ladder, where Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor Phipps, is informally cried out upon. And so too is her friend, Maria Cotton Mather, the daughter of the prominent minister John Cotton, the wife of Increase Mather, the leading minister of the colony, and also the mother of Cotton Mather, who's another prominent minister. It's all told. And this is something that people didn't realize, and I really dug into this, and especially looking at the informal accusations where people weren't charged. There were 5 ministers and 4 ministers' wives who were accused in 1692, and almost a third of the people accused were family members in some way of ministers. Others were actually members of the general court, the legislature of the colony. So the wealthiest merchant in Salem, Philip English, was accused. So I see these accusations in the pattern as sort of a symptom of the problems of the colony, where people were scared and angry. And they believed, I think, that their governors and their minister had let them down. And I'm not saying that they did this necessarily in a deliberative way, like, I hate the governor, I'm going to accuse him of witchcraft. But when people get really upset, their minds play tricks on them. And especially in 1692, we know witches are real. Absolutely. Everybody, even the learned ministers and university professors, know witches are real. And if you have that kind of atmosphere, it's not a stretch to start accusing people when things go wrong. So that's part of it. But also, too, if you look who the afflicted were, there's some interesting groups of people, and I think it sort of ties into who they accused. A lot of these afflicted girls and young women were household servants who were accusing their masters. And I strongly suspect, but will never be able to prove based on the evidence, that they're suffering from at the least verbal and probably physical abuse, and even just possibly, maybe even sexual abuse. And I can give you some examples of that if you want.
Sure, give us an example.
Okay, so one of the most interesting cases to me, and if you look at the men who were executed in Salem, tried and executed, the afflicted testified that and again, we're talking about these girls, mostly 18 to 20 or so, who were servants. They're testifying that their masters and these other men, that their specters are attacking them. And what do the specters do? They accuse the specters of striking them, beating them, whipping them. So it's not too far a stretch to think that probably these masters of their servants might have been doing similar. And frankly, in the 17th century in Massachusetts, men were patriarchal. They had a great deal of power. You were allowed a fair amount of latitude in disciplining your family, including limited amounts of physical violence. So it's interesting, if the specters are hitting the afflicted, probably the men are as well. And I'm particularly drawn by the case of John Proctor, who actually, and we have this in court testimony, this isn't a specter, this is John Proctor. He called his afflicted servant, a young woman named Mary Warren, he called her his jade. Now, that's an interesting 17th century term. It really is slang for a woman of ill repute, almost sort of like a prostitute or a sexual toy. And it's kind of an unsettling term, an icky term to me, if you think of a 60-year-old married guy with a pregnant wife and a number of children, to call his 20-year-old servant his jade. And what's even more unsettling, Liz, is Warren, when she testifies about Proctor and his specter, not only is he beating her, but at one point she says, John Proctor's specter approached me, and I grabbed him. I was sitting in a chair, and I grabbed his specter and pulled him down into my lap. Makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of innuendo there.
And again, it's the smoking gun. The intrigue and the beauty of studying the 17th century is, we don't have the thousands of pages of court records that we have today, or, things like the Watergate hearings where every word is written down and preserved. So we have to try to, draw on what we have, but it really sort of suggests that in some cases, at least, there's some sinister things going on there. And most of the men who were convicted of witchcraft had similar sorts of complaints of some kind of domestic violence against them. George Burroughs being a good example of this as well, too, a really kind of secretive, controlling husband who actually, the afflicted girls say that they see the ghosts of his two wives who died, accusing him of murdering them. So there's some issues there going on, I think, that are being brought to light through the afflictions that, we'll never know for sure, but very interesting stuff.
What was it like for John Proctor and George Burroughs and the other accused to stand trial, and who were the judges at these trials?
Well, I don't want you to think that these were kangaroo courts. This was an English justice system, and it had many of the rights and freedoms and processes that we enjoy today. There is evidence presented. We have grand juries. We have trial by jury. But there are some significant differences. Lawyers were actually outlawed in Massachusetts at this time, so there were no real lawyers in court, in particular, no defense attorneys. But instead, what you have in this case is a 9-member panel of judges. It was known formally as the Court of Oyer and Terminer, and they are there in theory to seek the truth. They operate as prosecutor and defense attorney, and they're there to protect the innocent, but also to punish the guilty. And usually this system worked. There had only been one witchcraft execution in Massachusetts in about the past 40 years, despite quite a few trials, and usually the judges were able to, get to the truth and make it clear that people were not actually witches, or more to the point, that you could never really prove someone was a witch, because it's a very hard thing to do. But in 1692, as we can see by the deaths of, in the end, of 25 people, 19 executed, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in prison, something went terribly wrong. And to me, there are lots of factors involved, hence a storm of witchcraft. It takes many things going wrong to create this perfect storm of tragedy and the largest witchcraft outbreak in American history. But I say there are 2 key factors. One is this acceptance by the court of spectral evidence, where it is really sort of questionable testimony at the time. And, it's not for reasons that you and I would think, Liz, as to why it's questionable. Today would say, well, of course, this is crazy, right? But again, in 1692, everyone believed in witches. Witches are empowered by Satan. Satan is created by God. So if you doubt the existence of witches, are you doubting the existence of God? No. So witches are very real, and they have powers. But the question is, can the devil or witches use the image, the specter of a good person, a blameless soul, a good Christian, to harm people? And many people believe they couldn't. And if that's the case, if John Proctor's specter is attacking poor Mary Warren, it must be because John Proctor is allowing it to happen, and that makes him a witch. So this is the sort of the problematic evidence that eventually will be thrown out and will bring the trials to their ends. But before that, it is the key factor in leading to every single charge in 1692 against someone for witchcraft is based on spectral evidence. Other evidence will be used in the court, but everyone is initially accused on that. So that's the big difference. But to me, the other big difference are the judges, because, again, before 1692, in courts, in some cases including these same judges, they're dismissing the charges. So what went wrong in 1692? And again, I think it's a lot of factors, but a lot of it revolves around the judges themselves, because they're really interesting men. Today we have divisions in government. We have separate powers. We have a division between church and state. But in 1692, those 9 men on the panel of the Court of Oyer and Terminer wore many hats. Let's put it this way. They're the leading men of the colony. They are members of the governor's council. Today we would call that our state senate. But also in that role then, they're also, imagine this, they're also your judges for the county courts and for the Supreme Court of the state. How do they get those jobs? Well, in some ways, things may not have changed that much in 300 years, because they're the wealthiest men in the colony, the wealthy merchants who are appointed to high office because of their prominence and wealth. By the way, Liz, these fellows had suffered serious losses in the ongoing war, had sawmills destroyed in Maine, and had really suffered today millions of dollars worth of losses in property. But at the same time, too, these guys who are the government and the legal system are also the militia officers. One of the judges, Waite Winthrop, is also the commander-in-chief of the Massachusetts Army that's losing the war. And most of the judges are militia officers, majors, captains, and colonels. So they're also responsible for this failed war effort. But I don't want you to get the idea that even though there are no lawyers in the group, these are well-educated men. 5 of them attended Harvard, yet none of them are ministers, which is what most people went to Harvard to do in the 17th century, right, to become a Puritan minister. So these sort of share class interests and ways of looking at things. But most importantly, I did the genealogical study of these fellows and found out that 6 of them are essentially brother-in-laws related through a series of marriages. So not only do they share the same class interests, but the exact same family interests. And based on everything that's going wrong in the colony, I think they see the events of 1692 as Satan being loose in the colony, and that's a predetermined fact. And it's really amazing. If you see the first day, the first pretrial hearings with the first accused, the questions start of poor Sarah Good, a somewhat poor and somewhat deranged woman. They say, Sarah Good, why do you afflict these children? How long have you been in league with Satan? And how are you doing this, right? I mean, they might as well just ask, and when did you stop beating your husband? There's no question that they know that Satan is loose and we have witches here, and our job is to round them up and convict them and return Salem and Massachusetts back to normal. And it is our job, even though we're not the ministers that we might have thought we were going to be when we went to Harvard, our job now as judges was all part of God's plan, because now it's the judges of Massachusetts who are going to save the colony, who are going to save the city upon the hill. This is not a job for ministers. This is a job for the government. So it's a fascinating group, and I have to say, I think where my books, people say, is maybe somewhat different than others in the past, is I spend a lot of time looking at the politics of the trials, because it seemed to me, you can have as many people accuse neighbors of witchcraft, or as many grand juries provide evidence against people, have people go through formal legal proceedings. It takes judges to accept jury verdicts of guilty. It takes judges to sign the death warrant. And in 1692, they were more than willing to do that. And that, to me, is the ultimate tragedy of 1692.
Tad, did I hear you correctly? There were 25 people executed for witchcraft?
There were 19 executed, 1 pressed to death, and 5 died in prison either after conviction or before trial. So in all, 25 people died directly as a result of the Salem trials. Yeah, that's a real tragedy.
You have 25 dead people from Massachusetts. Over 150 people have been accused. You have 9 judges who are looking for some reason to explain their financial and wartime losses. And this is the scene that Governor William Phips enters into in October 1692 when he's starting to look for an end to these trials. And one of the measures that Phips took to end the trials was to ban the publication of discourses or pamphlets about the trial. And in A Storm of Witchcraft, Tad notes that Phips's actions to curb free speech serves as, quote, the first large-scale government cover-up in American history, end quote. Tad, I think we need to explore this a bit. Would you help us understand why Phips looked to ban the publications and how his action constitutes the first large-scale government cover-up?
Sure. Here's the problem. Phips is the new governor of a new charter and a new government, and it's a fragile thing, and this is the last hope to save that Puritan experiment, right? But at this stage, by the fall of 1692, everyone realizes that at least 1 or 2 innocent lives have been lost. But the government can't admit to that. If they do, the king will bring the government to an end. And God help us, we could have Edmund Andros and the Dominion of New England and government dictatorship in the end of Puritanism. So Phips and Increase Mather cannot let the government fall. They cannot really allow people to write books saying what really happened. So what do? Governor Phips gets Increase Mather's son, Cotton, the brilliant young minister, to write essentially a shameless defense of the trials. It's a bit of intellectual legerdemain. He only looks at a very select pieces of the evidence to essentially say, look, yes, spectral evidence were used, but if you look at the people who were convicted, there's other evidence used against them, and essentially the government did the right thing, the judges did the right thing. Phips takes this book, writes a letter to the king in England and the Crown's council and says, okay, well, we've had this little problem with witchcraft, but here, as you can read by the eminent Cotton Mather's book, everything went according to plan. But, I've also issued a publication ban because we really don't need any more discourse on this because we have the right answer, right? We have the truth. And of course they didn't, because Phips knew that other people were preparing to write books, including even Increase Mather and other folks. And those books were somewhat critical of the government and were willing to sort of open the possibility that the government had erred. Phips couldn't allow that to happen because it would destroy the government. And it's a publication ban that actually lasts 3 years and stops people from essentially writing anything, and to a large degree, I think, probably even talking about the Salem witch trials. There was such a pall hung over the colony. So it really is the first thing that I know of where the government really tried to largely hide its actions, and to do so, though, in some ways for what they consider to be a very honorable reason, to protect that Puritan experiment, because to admit the lie and really to confess the sin of innocent death, which Puritans would have wanted to do, if they were to do that, then it would bring down the government, which would have been the bigger sin.
The Salem witch trials come to an end, largely because of Governor Phips's actions. What was it like for these communities where neighbor accused neighbor and divisions are sown within the community to try and heal after the witch trials?
Yeah, I spent about the last third of my book after 1692, because to me that's when the story gets interesting. That's when the Salem witch trials, I think, really kind of become a turning point in American history. And you can see this in Salem Village and surrounding communities where it really took several generations for the communities to heal. Many people left Salem as soon as possible and spread out to other communities. Particularly many of the victims and their families are surviving victims, and the families of victims left and moved to new communities. In other cases, people, you can imagine the tension when you have witchcraft accusing family and victim's family sitting on the same bench in the Salem Village meeting house. I studied this as best I could to try to get at some of these things, and I actually came up with a fascinating pattern of what I refer to as healing marriages, where, and in some cases, more than 100 years later, you had marriages between grandchildren of accusers and accused, trying to heal those long-standing breaches between families. And I mean, so it seems fairly clear that, that again, for a generation or two, times were very tense, and we know actually that families of the victims were actually petitioning the Massachusetts General Court for redress of grievances, for pardons for deceased loved ones or survivors as late as the 1740s. More than 50 years after the trials, Liz, the Massachusetts General Court is still regularly debating this and wondering how they can make amends. And clearly, these conversations had to have been going on in Salem Village. So it wasn't like, okay, the witch trials are officially over, let's all get back to normal. It just didn't happen that way. This was a long healing process, and frankly, a process where it's still a healing process going on in Salem and Danvers to this very day.
Speaking of today, since we are so close to Halloween, it's just a few days away. I mean, Salem is a destination for Halloween tourism. Is being Witch City part of its healing process, or is that something completely different?
It's really, it's some of both. It took Salem 300 years to the tercentenary to finally be willing to put up a memorial to the victims. They tried repeatedly in the 19th century and even as recently as the 1920s, and the wound was still too raw. There were still too many people who took offense at the idea of an apology. So I think the corner finally turned in the 1970s and 1980s, but it's turned in a very strange way because, as you note, Salem is a post-industrial city that makes a large amount of its revenue and its economy these days based on tourism. It's an amazing city, and people should come for the great architecture and the history and the Peabody Essex Museum and all kinds of amazing things. But people largely come for haunted happenings in October around Halloween, which has become, unfortunately, in some ways, a celebration. And to me, if you have the deaths of 25 really innocent Christians, many people in Salem kind of question how appropriate this is. If you come to Halloween in Salem, where there'll be about 100,000 people in the streets in a kind of a Mardi Gras-like carnival or celebration, there are also many of us who are kind of like shaking our heads and saying, but we know we really need to be reflective on this. And there actually are groups in Salem that are very much concerned about this. There's an organization that runs the Salem Memorial and sponsors lectures really on human rights and freedoms to try to address these issues. So in some ways, Salem has had a change of heart and is really having a serious look at its problems and its past and how it links to its present and its future. But on the other hand, too, in many ways, the city still relies heavily on that tourist income, which is generated really kind of on the backs of those innocent Christians who died in 1692. So I tell you, it's a really wonderful place to be a historian and to study this time period and to sort of see it still played out and still very much play a role today, where I think Salem has become a place where many people move there deliberately. There's a modern-day population of witches known as, they call themselves Wiccans or pagans, and they feel very welcome in Salem because they know that it's a place where people, based on its history, don't want to judge other people, right? Where people are allowed to be themselves and to be open about themselves. So in that sense, it's a very open and embracing community. Yet every October we have haunted happenings. So it's an interesting dichotomy.
I can tell from the way you talk about it and from reading your book that the memory of the Salem witch trials fascinates you almost as much as the witch trials. And I think this is actually a perfect transition for the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
So along this counterfactual memory line here, Tad, in your opinion, what might have happened if Sir William Phipps and Cotton Mather hadn't worked to end the witch trials? How many more people might have stood accused and died, and how would the history of Massachusetts Bay and New England be different?
In the fall of 1692, there were still many people who wanted the trials to continue. The accusations continued. Some figures are as high as there may have been as many as 300 people accused at that time informally. The Chief Justice of the court, William Stoughton, was outraged that Phipps ended the trials. So I think if Phipps and the Mathers hadn't really sort of stepped forward, that it really could have spiraled and had a very nasty turn because people were afraid to speak out. But eventually, I think you could have had hundreds of lives lost. And this happened, we know, in the 1650s in East Anglia in England, there was an outbreak where, well over 100 people were executed. So thank God Phipps did, because I think it would have, you may have had hundreds of people accused. And if the government hadn't stepped forward and finally done something, at some point I suspect there may have been some kind of revolt or revolution led by those people who were willing to stand up to what they saw as a clear injustice. Would have been a really interesting story then, wouldn't it?
It would be, and it's already a fascinating story the way it happened.
Absolutely.
Dad, your last two books have been on witchcraft in New England. You have an app that we can download for our smartphones that will show us witch history here in Massachusetts. Are you still working on witchcraft, or what are you researching and writing about now?
I'm taking a short break. I'm actually starting to do some work on recreating 16th and 17th century historic beer recipes with a local microbrewery, Earth Eagle Brewings in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So I may write a small publication on recreating colonial recipes for beers and what it's actually like, where you can come into a modern-day brewery and try them. But my more serious, more scholarly project is to try to write a history of early New England, or in early New Englanders, as viewed through their material culture. As an archaeologist, I've excavated many sites, and it's a project I've been working on for a long time. But I think we can learn a lot about people, not just through things like witchcraft, but also through studying the ceramics they ate off of, the tobacco pipes they smoked out of, the furniture they had, the portraits and things like that. So that's the next book, and I guess my goal is going to be to have it out by 2020 in time for the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower, of course.
Well, that's a fantastic goal. I hope you make it. And please, don't downplay the importance of historic beer. It sounds like a fascinating project.
I would never do that, Liz. Don't worry. Well, you'll have to, if you come up to meet me in Portsmouth sometime, and we can talk about it over historic ale.
That sounds like a perfect afternoon. Where's the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can get in contact with you if we still have more witchcraft questions?
Best place to get me, I have a lot of information up at my website at Salem State University. I mean, it's one of these long email addresses. The best way to just get in touch, if you just Google Emerson Baker and Salem State University, it should direct you to my homepage where you have information on my publications, my email address, and a lot of information about the witch trials, and also all sorts of information about my archaeology excavations on 17th century sites and illustrations of objects and stuff like that. So that's the best starting point to get in touch, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
And you tweet too, right?
Absolutely. Tweet at Emerson W. Baker for tweets, and also on Facebook as well. So widely available in all kinds of media formats to answer your pressing concerns about witchcraft. I do actually have daily tweets on the events of 1692, so feel free to follow at Emerson W. Baker.
Tad, happy Halloween, and thank you so much for sharing the story of the Salem witchcraft trials with us.
Thanks, Liz. Happy hauntings to you, too.
I don't know about you, but I really wish we knew for certain what sparked the witchcraft hysteria that gripped Salem and Massachusetts in 1692. I know that our inability to know is part of what makes the Salem witchcraft trials both interesting and haunting, but I want to know anyway. Of course, as I wonder what caused the witch scare, I realize that we must be careful not to overlook the fact that the cause of the witchcraft scare might possibly have been actual witchcraft. After all, 17th century Puritans believed in witches and the powers the devil granted them. You can find more information about Tad, his book, A Storm of Witchcraft, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/053. Would you please tell your friends, family members, and acquaintances about Ben Franklin's World? The best way to discover a podcast is by word-of-mouth recommendations, and I would greatly appreciate yours, because it will help us find fellow history lovers who are not yet aware of our show. Don't forget to check out our new crowdfunding campaign. If you love Ben Franklin's World and would like to find out more about how you can help support the show, please visit benfranklinsworld.com/support or text SupportBFWorld, that's one word, supportbfworld to 33444, which will send you the link for the crowdfunding page. Finally, have you ever been to Salem for haunted happenings? If so, what was your experience like? Send an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook. Admittedly, I have not been to Salem for haunted happenings. I think about going every year, but the idea of competing with so many people for restaurants, parking, and tours just seems daunting. With that said, I have stood on Gobbler's Knob on Groundhog's Day to see if Punxsutawney Phil would see his shadow. It was a very cold and rainy day. I guess we're lucky it wasn't snowing, but it was a cold and rainy day, and they shined so much light on Phil, they made it nearly impossible for him not to see his shadow.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.